This is 7th Street southwest of Miami, the very tiny edge between the downtown of the city with its posh restaurants, hotels and boutiques, and the historical neighborhood Little Havana with its out-of-shape buildings where the most of Cuban exiles are living. At 8 a.m. the city is empty. Miami wakes up late. The only crowd is of elderly people in the Domino Club constructing elaborate block patterns. This is Raul. He moved to the U.S. in the first wave of Cuban exiles. He was born in Havana into a wealthy family. In 1961, during the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was brought to the U.S.
The situation that was created between the U.S. government and the Catholic welfare, where they shipped 15,000 kids to the U.S. in order to avoid the military induction into the Castro government. I came here with my sister. My parents stayed in Cuba.
Raul had to grow up very quickly. After a childhood in a loving family with the nannies and tutors, housekeepers and drivers, he was placed in an orphanage for 3 years. The U.S. failed to overthrow Castro's regime, and after 3 years of the government blackmailing Raul's family, they left Cuba, leaving all their property in the country and reuniting with Raul in the U.S. Since that time, 1964, the entire family has never visited Cuba.
I think it'll stay exactly the same. It's been too many generations on that particular regime and that way of thought. And there is it's going to take another 50 years to become what it used to be. I don't think it'll ever become what it used to be.
This is Marco. He is a friend of Raul's and he is also an exile. He left Cuba soon after Fidel Castro took power. He reached Jamaica, then moved to Mexico and asked for political asylum on the Mexican-American border in 1961.
Left and I was young, adventure. I'm glad I did.
How was Cuba?
For me, it was good. My father used to work all year round in the railroad. Now some other people, no.
Why? Why?
Because they didn't have to work, they don't have a job. Cuban people here too, we talk a lot of bullshit about Cuba. Most people in the countryside, they were illiterate, and they had no work after the sugar cane harvest. There was nothing to do until next year.
The distance between Miami and Havana is just 90 miles by sea. During the years of trade embargo and political tension between the U.S. and Cuba, thousands of Cubans made the journey in boats and ships. The main goal of all exiles was to reach the American shoreline with a so-called dry fleet. According to the so-called law of wet dry foot, the U.S. Coast Guard sent back to Cuba all those who were seized in the water. The lucky ones who reached the shore were allowed to stay. In Miami, there are now more than 1 million Cubans. They make up 20% of the population of the metropolitan area. Miami was the first city in the U.S. with a bilingual Spanish-English school program. Late on Saturday, around noon, a long queue waits for homemade food: black beans, baked fish, chicken with mango and orange, and homemade mojitos. This is how Little Havana wakes up. Tim, the owner of the street food cafe, left Cuba in 1981. After 20 years of Castro's regime, Cuba was struggling with hunger as thousands of people in Havana surrounded the embassy of Peru asking for political asylum. In those days, Castro didn't stand in the way of anyone who wanted to leave the country. Professionals and intellectuals were among those who left, packed shoulder to shoulder on the boats with prostitutes, alcoholics, the mentally ill, and anyone else the Cuban government considered undesirable. These groups of people also often had their property confiscated by the state. This is Pete. He was born in Miami. His parents were anti-Batista, the previous Cuban dictator, and anti-Castro. They left the country in 1958, in the very first days of the resistance. Pete runs a family cafe, making for tourists the same milkshakes and smoothies as they would find in Havana or Vinales. Despite the recent opening of Cuban embassy in the U.S., he is not inclined to visit Havana.
I call it the evolution of slavery. It's just incredible. I think that's what Fidel Castro will be known for in the Castro family. It's the evolution of slavery. He hires and trains and rates kids from the age of 9, 10, 12, 13 years old and puts and educates them accordingly in order to put them out to work and sub them out to the masses. And he gets paid for it.
The Cuban diaspora in Miami, inspired by 3 senators of Cuban heritage, strongly opposes re-establishing diplomatic relations between Cuba and the U.S. because political prisoners in Cuban jails will remain behind bars, and a trade embargo, which can be cancelled only by the U.S. Congress, will remain in force. But this is a brand new game. Reporting for Ukraine Today, this is Natalka Pisna in Miami, Florida.